Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Layman Rap Podcast. I am your host, Mr. 215, Irving Henderson. On today's show, we look back at the greatest offensive performance in NFL history as the Philadelphia Eagles won their first Super Bowl championship over the New England Patriots. The trade deadline came and went in the NBA, and the biggest moves were made by the Cleveland Cavaliers. Is it enough to vault them back to the top of the Eastern Conference? For our second Black History Month Spotlight, we will discuss the life and career of Althea Gibson. And in our weekly rant, I will give some proper and much overdue respect to Eagles head coach Doug Peterson. So sit back, relax, grab a beverage, and lend me your ear for a few minutes. This is the Layman Rap Podcast. And hello, everyone. Once again, we are here with another installment of the Layman Rap Podcast. Now, my voice sounds a little different than normal because yesterday I was out at the Philadelphia Eagles Super Bowl championship parade. So I did some screaming. If you heard my little after Super Bowl podcast, I had been anticipating this moment for quite some time. It was a good time out there. The estimates right now have been anywhere between 700,000, which is about the lowest amount I've heard, to upward of over 2 million people who were down along the streets in Philadelphia, stretching from South Broad Street back at the sports complex, and then going all the way down to the art museum where the team showed off the Lombardi Trophy for the fans. There were plenty of players who spoke, none more passionately than Jason Kelce. I think that he was swept up in the moment. A lot of the things that he said was very true about how the Eagles were perceived within the media, not just nationally, but even locally. The talk about Jay Ajayi, having injury concerns and being a malcontent. Jason Kelce dropped the F word a few times, even sung the "No One Likes Us, We Don't Care" Philly song. But I know a lot of people were saying, oh, I can't believe he did that. I'm not going to get upset with a person who was speaking passionately and from the heart. I do understand there were children out there, but, unless your child is completely sheltered, I'm quite certain your child has heard those words come out of your mouth, your spouse's mouth, another adult's mouth. I'm not saying it was an appropriate thing for Jason Kelce to do, but I'm saying I'm not going to make a huge issue out of it. So what a game Super Bowl 52 was. The teams, the Eagles and the Patriots, combined for 1,151 yards. That is the most in NFL history in any game. Postseason, regular season, that is the most amount of yards ever in any one game in NFL history. And Tom Brady and Nick Foles lit the scoreboard up and set the record books on fire on Sunday. And it was kind of an amazing thing to see that not only were both defenses ineffective, but just the simple fact that Nick Foles, who, for lack of a better, designation, is pretty much a journeyman quarterback. Now, I know he was drafted by the Eagles before Andy Reid left town. He was sent off to I think he went to the St. Louis Rams first. And he was cut. And there's a glorious clip of Jeff Fisher letting Nick Foles know that he was being cut, and he wished him the best and said he hopes he lands on his feet. And the irony of Jeff Fisher, wishing someone the best and hoping that they land on their feet is not lost on me, because here's a guy who was perpetually mediocre as a head coach, and he loses his job with the Rams, and his three previous starting quarterbacks, Nick Foles, Case Keenum, and Jared Goff, all made the postseason. They all made the postseason. Case Keenum was one win away from playing for the Super Bowl. And Nick Foles, of course, as you all know, was Super Bowl MVP, which is, amazing considering his story. But to see Nick Foles, of all people, continue to answer the challenge every time it looked as if the Patriots were going to begin to take that game over, Nick Foles and that Eagles offense went out and put more points on the board. There was one punt between the two teams. The Eagles were the team that punted, but there were no punt returns. And that was the first time in Super Bowl history that there was 0 yards on punt returns. Tom Brady became the first NFL player in history, again, not just the Super Bowl, in history, to throw for over 500 yards. He had 505 yards passing. He became the first quarterback to throw for over 500 yards and at least 3 touchdown passes to lose that game. And, of course, the Patriots scoring 33 points. That was the most points ever scored by a team who, in fact, lost the Super Bowl. There was an aggressive play call in the second quarter. Going into halftime, the Eagles had a chance to just kick the field goal, go for 3, be satisfied with those 3 points. And Nick Foles came over to the sideline, said to Doug Peterson, Philly, Philly. And Doug Peterson, almost without any hesitation, said, let's do it. It was a reverse that the ball was directly snapped to Corey Clement. Corey Clement pitched the ball to Trey Burton, who was a high school quarterback. He was even a college quarterback for a time. He flipped it back out to Nick Foles, and Foles caught a touchdown pass, becoming the first quarterback to catch a touchdown pass in the Super Bowl. And magnifying that play, the New England Patriots ran a similar play earlier in the game, and Tom Brady was just as wide open as Nick Foles was. This wasn't close to the red zone, however, but the ball went right off of Brady's fingertips. Doug Peterson continued to call the same aggressive play calling that he did all season long, and his team rewarded it for him. The Eagles were 12 out of 18 on both third and fourth down. On the game-winning touchdown drive, Foles found Zach Ertz for about 2.5-yard gain on 4th and 1. That Eagles team looked at the Patriots, didn't blink, kept moving the ball offensively, kept getting the ball into the end zone, and both defenses really did nothing, little to nothing, to help the cause in this game. The Patriots would get an interception. The turnover battle would be even. But now, when the Eagles needed a defensive stop the most, leading by 5, headed towards the 2-minute warning, and how many times have we seen Tom Brady just pick you apart in those situations? And Brandon Graham, who is a defensive end, was lined up inside, made his move past Shaq Mason, got his hand on the football, knocked it out of Brady's hands. It was recovered by Derek Barnett. And in a game in which the defense was not at their best at all, they picked the absolute perfect time to come up with not only a big play, but a turnover. Led to a Jake Elliott field goal, and that provided the 41-33 margin of victory for the Eagles as Tom Brady's Hail Mary pass hit the turf, and that was it. There was a delayed reaction by everyone there and everyone at home, because you had no idea that the clock had run out. You had no idea up until, everything settled. There were no flags, and that was it. The Eagles became Super Bowl champions. But this game, of course, as just about every game has been in the NFL this year, wasn't without its fair share of controversy. Uh, the Eagles scored 2 touchdowns that needed to be reviewed. And the first was a beautifully thrown ball by Nick Foles to Corey Clement. And there was question as to whether or not he had gained full possession before taking his first step. Now, he took 3 steps. The third step was on the back end zone line, chalk. But he had the ball secured when he made his first step. And the ball sort of shifted a little, but never to the point where he lost control of it. The ball never came off of his body at any point. Then he made the second step. Third step was on the line. He ended up rolling into, a camera well. And there was question as to whether he was in. But the review and Gene Steratore, who was the referee for the game, watched it on the little replay monitor that they have for the referees, and he didn't see anything that would have constituted Clement losing possession of the ball at any point. The touchdown stood, and you would have thought that that would have been the end of the controversy in this game. It was not. Zach Ertz, with the Eagles down 33-32, caught a pass on a slant from Nick Foles, took 3 steps, made a lunge for the end zone, ball crossed the plane. As he falls, the ball pops up and then pops right back into his arm. And there was many comparisons to that of the Dez Bryant catch from a few years ago and even Jesse James's catch from this past season. Now, I'd like to say the referees got both of these calls right after review. And this is exactly what the rule is intended for. I think there were times, there were several plays that you looked at, thought it was a catch, and the refs say no catch. I think they got these 2 calls right. There's no comparison to either of those plays. I do understand how some would say the Jesse James play was kind of similar. The Dez Bryant play was nowhere near similar. There's a huge difference between a player running, falling, and still being in the process of a catch and losing control of the ball, and a player catching the ball, running, and then lunging for the end zone. So it was a very remarkable game by both of these 2 teams. The Philadelphia Eagles won. They had their parade, as I stated yesterday, on Thursday morning, and it was a happening. It was definitely a happening, and everything was just beautiful. And to cap it off, Jason Kelce's speech. Oh, my goodness. Oh, what a speech that was. There was just so much fire in his voice. And the fans were right there with him, hanging on every word. And nothing he said wasn't true. Howie Roseman was sort of, sent packing to a, different part of the building where no one saw him. And people did say that, Lane Johnson was, on the juice. And Doug Peterson, one of the worst head coaching hires in NFL history. He wasn't qualified to be a coach. And I'll get into that on my final segment when I speak about Doug Peterson and the way that he has been maligned. Not just in the national media, but maligned by the local media and maligned by the fan base as well. And make no mistake about it, the New England Patriots have the tools, they have the resources, they have the coach, they have the quarterback to make a long run again next season. The Eagles have a lot of decisions to make this offseason. Who stays, who goes. If they get a good enough offer for Nick Foles, is Nick Foles gone? But it was an amazing Super Bowl. If you have not seen it, if you have yet to see the Super Bowl yet, and I doubt that anyone listening hasn't, But if you haven't seen it yet, it's within your best interest, if you love football, to check this game out and enjoy it. And I also want to say that over the past few years, we've gotten a reverse in trend where the Super Bowl is no longer the long, boring 3-hour snore fest where by halftime you'd rather be doing anything else than watching the Super Bowl. If you grew up in the late 80s and the early 90s, almost all of those games were blowouts. I mean, you can start right at Super Bowl 17. And Super Bowl 17 Super Bowl 18. Super Bowl 18 started this trend of just blowouts in the Super Bowl. The Raiders blew the Redskins out. And then the 49ers blew the Dolphins out. And then the Bears blew the Patriots out. And then the Giants manhandled the Broncos. And then Washington manhandled the Broncos. You got a good game that came down to the wire with Joe Montana against the Cincinnati Bengals. Then the 49ers pasted the Broncos. And then you hit the 90s, and the Giants win on a missed field goal. And then the Redskins pummel the Bills. And then the Cowboys pummel the Bills in back-to-back years. And then the 49ers do all types of things to the San Diego Chargers. So it's great that football, when we get down to the last game of the NFL season, it's great that recently we've had some very exciting games. I don't know what next season is going to hold, but I hope that next year is just as exciting around the league as this year was. So that is it for our first segment. We'll be right back, and we'll have talk on what's going on in the NBA right now. We'll be right back. And we're back with the Layman Rap Podcast. And what a day around the NBA yesterday as the Cleveland Cavaliers completely shook their roster up. They have been playing some of the worst basketball around the league since Christmas. And you knew Cleveland was going to do something. I did not expect Cleveland to do something this drastic. The Cavs traded Iman Shumpert, Dwayne Wade, Channing Frye, Isaiah Thomas, Jay Crowder, Derrick Rose, and a first-round draft pick in a flurry of moves yesterday. And in return, they added George Hill, Rodney Hood, Larry Nance Jr., and Jordan Clarkson to their roster. And I think that was a smart move by the Cavaliers. The Cavaliers went out and picked up some young talent, and this is going to make it a decision, and no pun intended, that LeBron James is going to have to come down to making in this offseason as far as what he's going to do as a free agent. The Cavaliers went out and brought in more young talent. Hopefully for that franchise to extend this run with LeBron James a little bit longer. But it also did something else with this move. It also protected them in the off chance that LeBron James decides he'd rather go somewhere else. And that's certainly his decision, and he's free to make that decision. It's his decision to make. But the Cleveland Cavaliers, this time around, as opposed to the first time when LeBron left, have set themselves up for a brighter future. They did not trade away the pick that they got from the Brooklyn Nets, which right now looks like it's going to be somewhere in the top 5. So if LeBron James does decide to leave again, they're not stuck with, a wealth of players that no one wants. And older, aging veterans or anything like that. They have a nice young core that should LeBron leave, they would be able to build around that. And it's almost as if at this stage, Cleveland is admitting that they made a mistake in picking up Isaiah Thomas. Because Cleveland traded Cleveland traded Kyrie Irving to the Boston Celtics for Isaiah Thomas. It's not working out. It just was not working out. And meanwhile, the Boston Celtics are still at the top of the Eastern Conference. And you got to wonder right now, does this move or these set of moves by the Cleveland Cavaliers put them back in the mix as favorites in the East? And I don't know. I don't know. I'm not going to say that they can't get back to the finals, but you have a team full of young guys, and some young guys who have no playoff pedigree, have never even appeared in the playoffs in some cases, and it's going to take a while for this team to come together, especially when you're talking about trading away, 6 players off your roster. And the Lakers, who were a part of that deal that sent Larry Nance Jr. and Jordan Clarkson to the Cavs, are rolling right now. And Lonzo Ball is out with an injury, and it has not stopped the Lakers from rolling. They defeated the Oklahoma City Thunder in their nationally televised game on TNT yesterday, and they won by 25 points. And that was a shorthanded Lakers team because they were missing guys due to the trade. And they went out and put something on the Thunder. And right now, the Lakers may be putting themselves in a situation where they're going to have to make some decisions on what do they do when Lonzo Ball comes back. You wonder, is there something about the guys that they're playing right now that would make the Lakers say, okay, you know what, Lonzo, we're going to have you come off the bench? Or do the Lakers, completely reinsert Lonzo Ball into the starting lineup and risk upsetting the harmony and the cohesiveness that this team is playing with right now? 76ers did not make a single trade yesterday, although they were rumored to be interested in several players. They didn't make a single trade, and I want to state for the record, that was actually the right thing to do. Number one, the Sixers have no tradable assets on the roster right now. I don't think anyone's interested in Jared Bayless. I don't think anyone's interested in James Michael McAdoo, who's a two-way player. I don't think anyone's interested in Timothy Luwawu-Cabarrot. I don't think the Sixers have any moves that they could have made that did not require them to attach a draft pick to. And I think right now the Sixers want to hang in as far as the draft is concerned and keep their draft picks. And also, you got to look at it from this point as well. The Sixers are not going to contend for the Eastern Conference Championship this year. If they were to make a move, they would have had to make a move for a guy who, launches them into the conversation as, winning the Eastern Conference. I just don't see anyone out there on the blocks right now that the Sixers could have picked up that would have improved this roster by leaps and bounds. I just don't. Sometimes no move is good move, and this is a situation where no move was a very good move for the Sixers. Stand pat, let this team run its course. You have next offseason to make decisions on who you're going to add, who you're going to subtract, and I don't think the Sixers had to make a move at the trade deadline. I know it would have been a great move to appease the fans, but every move can't be about appeasing the fans. Moves have to be made about doing the right thing for your franchise. And I think the Sixers made the absolute right call by not making any deals yesterday. And as far as the Cavaliers are concerned, one last point on this. I would like to say that Cleveland did the absolute right thing that they had to do. I know there are some people saying, well, why would you trade so many, quality veterans? Those quality veterans weren't getting the job done. And this is a win now attitude that Cleveland has to play with. Cleveland can't afford to say, okay, we made the playoffs. No, when you are the defending conference champions, you have a bullseye on your chest. And everyone is coming for you. So they had to make the necessary moves to get better. Time will tell whether or not this was the right decision for this season. But for going forward, this was definitely the right decision for the Cleveland Cavaliers. All right, we'll be right back with our Black History Month Spotlight. And this week, it will be on golf player, Althea Gibson. We'll be right back. And welcome back to the Layman Rap Podcast. It is now time for our Black History Month Spotlight segment. And today we shine that spotlight on Althea Gibson. Althea Gibson was born on August 25th, 1927, in Clarendon County, South Carolina. In the 1930s, her family would move from South Carolina to Harlem, New York. The apartment her family lived in was in a police athletic league designated play area. That meant that during daylight hours, the street would be blocked off so that neighborhood children could play organized sports. Gibson would become an excellent player at paddle tennis. Paddle tennis is a game similar to the traditional tennis game, but it is played on a shorter court and with a paddle instead of a racket. In 1939, and at the age of 12, she would win the New York City Paddle Tennis Women's Championship. In 1940, she began practicing traditional tennis, and the following year, she would enter and win her first tournament. Gibson would win the American Tennis Association Girls Division Championship in 1944 and 1945. She would move up to the women's division the next year, and although she would lose in the finals, Gibson would win in 1947, beginning a 10-year run as women's national champion. In 1956, she became the first African American to win a major Grand Slam tennis event when she won the French Open. Gibson would also win the doubles tournament at that same event with her partner, Angela Buxton. Her and Buxton would also win the doubles tournament at Wimbledon that same year. In 1957, Gibson would dominate. She would become the first black champion at Wimbledon and would also become the first champion ever to receive the championship trophy from Queen Elizabeth II. Gibson was quoted as saying, "Shaking hands with the Queen of England was a long way from being forced to sit in the colored section of the bus." A month after Wimbledon, she would win the U.S. Open. She would reach the finals of 8 Grand Slam events in 1957, also winning the doubles tournament at Wimbledon and the Australian Open and the mixed doubles at the U.S. Open. At year's end, she became the first black player on the United States Whiteman Cup team. That team won the Whiteman Cup by defeating Great Britain. The next year, Gibson would win both Wimbledon and the U.S. Open again, and she became the number 1 ranked female tennis player in the world. In 1957 and 58, she would be named AP Female Athlete of the Year. Gibson would also be the first black woman to appear on the cover of the magazines Sports Illustrated and Time. At the end of 1958, and after winning 56 total championships, Althea Gibson would retire from tennis. At age 37, Gibson would become the first African American woman to join the LPGA Tour. Although she would break records for scoring in an individual round, she would not win a single tournament during her golf career, which ended in 1978. During the 70s, Gibson would run Pepsi's National Mobile Tennis Project. This program would bring nets and other tennis equipment to underprivileged cities across America. On September 28, 2003, Althea Gibson passed away at the age of 76. Althea Gibson, this week's Black History Month Spotlight Athlete. We'll be right back to close out the show. You are listening to the Layman Rap Podcast. And we are back with the Layman Rap Podcast as we get ready to close things out for this episode. It is now time for the weekly rant, and this week the weekly rant is brought to you by Dunkin' Donuts. America runs on Dunkin'. And our weekly rant this week is on Philadelphia Eagles head coach Doug Peterson. When Doug Peterson was named head coach of the Philadelphia Eagles in 2016, it was a lot of skepticism in this town about bringing him in. A lot of people figured that he would be, Andy Reid 2.0, an Andy Reid clone. If you ever saw the movie Rocky 5, and how Rocky was training a fighter, how he was training Tommy Gunn to become heavyweight champion, and they were calling him, a puppet and Rocky's robot. Well, that is what people thought about Doug Peterson. They thought he was Andy Reid 2.0. And in the press conference, when Peterson was named head coach, one of the things that Peterson was, lauded for by Jeffrey Lurie was his ability to connect with his players on an emotional level. And I know people heard that and sort of kind of rolled their eyes as if to say, that's not really that important. But if you think about this team that won the Super Bowl on Sunday, you are talking about a team that, for all intents and purposes, had no business being in that game. None. But they were there because their head coach never once flinched, never once wavered, never once deviated from the plan. And the plan was to win a championship. And it took Doug Peterson 2 years to rid the stench of the brief, but yet very destructive and disruptive Chip Kelly era of the Philadelphia Eagles. Chip Kelly treated his players as if they were a science experiment and had them wear devices and, drinking special shakes and sort of concoctions and it was almost as if they weren't players. They were cattle being herded. And the players tuned that out. But you don't see that with this team under Doug Peterson. This team, appears to be a very tight-knit group. When players went down, they didn't just go home and say, okay, I'm going to go home, I'm going to rehab, I'm going to get better, and I'll see you guys, next year at training camp. Guys stuck around. Jason Peters was still going to every meeting to help out Halapulu. Oh, boy, I can't say his name. Big V, Vitae. I can't believe I actually tried to pronounce his first name. I get it sometimes I can't. This is one of the moments where I couldn't get it. Carson Wentz didn't just leave. He stayed around and he was in meetings every morning with Nick Foles. And Darren Sproles didn't leave. He stuck around. And when all of those guys were injured, everyone who had to step up in that place stepped up and did an admirable job of replacing the player whose spot they had to fill in that moment. This was probably one of the best coaching jobs this past season that we may have ever seen. I mean, yeah, backup quarterbacks have won Super Bowls before. Lesser quarterbacks have won Super Bowls before. But for this team to have so many impactful injuries and rise above them all and still end up holding the Vince Lombardi trophy at the end of the season, a lot of that credit goes to the head coach for keeping his thumb on the pulse of his locker room. And not just, in a sort of condescending way. Doug Peterson met with his, leadership group on a weekly basis, and he heard what they had to say, and he didn't just listen to them. Whatever they had to say, if Doug Peterson looked at it and felt as if it was good for the benefit of the team, he went with it. The Eagles sort of struggled their way into the playoffs before playing against Atlanta in that first divisional playoff game. And the players went to Doug Peterson prior to the start of practice and said, listen, we were hitting. Practices were intense. It got to a point where if we're beating up on each other to a certain extent, you can't wait to beat up somebody in a different colored jersey. And they went out and practiced the week of the divisional playoff round, and they were back to hitting because Doug Peterson listened to what his players felt was needed at that particular moment in time. There was no hesitation in Doug Peterson when Nick Foles walked over to him and said, I want to run Philly, Philly. And Doug Peterson looked at him right in the face and said, let's do it. Doug Peterson was maligned by the media, and Michael Lombardi called him the least qualified candidate for any head coaching position in the history of sports. He didn't just say football. He said in the history of sports, Doug Peterson was the least qualified head coaching candidate he'd ever seen. And on Thursday, during the parade and after Jason Kelce made his speech, Michael Lombardi went onto Twitter and said he deserved everything that was said by Jason Kelce because he didn't think Doug Peterson had it. And he did. And these guys played for Doug Peterson. And he squeezed everything he could out of this team. And they followed his lead. And it turned into a Super Bowl championship. Doug Peterson may not end up as beloved in this town as Dick Vermeil or Buddy Ryan. And he's certainly not going to be hated in this town like Rich Kotite, like Chip Kelly, like Joe Kuharich. But Doug Peterson etched his name in the history books. He is forever a Super Bowl winning head coach. You cannot take that away from him. And you cannot take the championship away from his team. Doug Peterson deserves all of the praise you can heap on him right now. Because Doug Peterson did what no one thought he could do. When everybody saw the injuries mounting up and when Carson Wentz went down in LA with a torn ACL, hope was lost as far as what kind of future did the season hold for the Eagles. No one And I don't think, maybe even some of the guys in the locker room thought this was going to happen, but it did. And Doug Peterson deserves a vast majority of the credit for it. Yeah, I know Howie Roseman went out and made the right moves, and that's great. But in war, it doesn't matter who supplies the weapons. What matters is who's using the weapons and can they use those weapons properly. And that is what Doug Peterson did. We all saw what type of 2016 Nelson Aguilar had. Doug Peterson never lost confidence in Nelson Aguilar. So much so that the guy who was above and beyond the best receiver the Eagles had in 2016, Jordan Matthews, got traded. So that Aguilar had the space to grow. Doug Peterson deserves a ton of credit for the job he did this year. The fact that he only received one first place vote in the voting for Coach of the Year is just ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Sean McVay, great head coach, did a great job of turning that franchise around. I'm not going to say anything negative about Sean McVay. He had the Rams playing, lights out for the majority of the season, but Sean McVay went head to head with Doug Peterson, and Doug Peterson won. I don't know how far or how long the Philadelphia Eagles will be able to get by with the, no one respects us, no one likes us mentality. But if things keep going the way they're going right now, at some point, the underdog becomes top dog. All right, everyone, that is it for our show. I'd like to thank the good people at Dunkin' Donuts over on 56 and Chestnut for providing me breakfast this morning and asking me to give them this little shout out. So there it is. If you're in that area, please check out the people over at Dunkin' Donuts on 56 and Chestnut. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the end of the show. I am your host, Mr. 215 Irving Henderson. Thank you for listening once again. I'll see you next week. So long, everybody.